afternoon and welcome. My name is Liddy and this is The Full Scottish on Sunday the 9th of July. I'm joined here in the studio today by two excellent guests. We have Sandra White. Sandra, welcome. Sandra, you were a former MSP for Glasgow Kelvin, a post that you held for 10 years. From 2011 to 2021, but before that you represented Glasgow as a list MSP from 1999, and you held an impressive 37 roles at the Scottish Parliament. So you're a regular contributor here to the show, so welcome.
Good morning, Brian. Thank you for inviting me on.
Not at all, it's great to have you. And Martyn Day, you're SNP MP for Linlithgow and East Falkirk. You're also the SNP spokesperson for health since 2021. Martyn, you were part of the 2015 intake of SNP MPs to Westminster, the very same intake that Mary Black was part of when the SNP turned the political map of Scotland and almost entirely yellow. So welcome to The Full Scottish.
No, glad to be back.
So I'll start today's programme then with a routine Ukraine update, and today is day 501 of the Ukraine war. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has announced the return of 5 military commanders who were previously expected to have to remain in Turkey until the end of the war. The men led the defence of the city of Mariupol until surrendering to Russian forces last year and had been sent to Turkey under the terms of a prisoner exchange brokered by Ankara. Russia has claimed the return of the men represents a direct violation of the terms of the existing agreements by both Ukraine and Turkey. President Biden is travelling to Europe, stopping in the UK today before heading on to Lithuania for the NATO summit in Vilnius. He will participate in meetings with leaders who will debate the war in Ukraine and revise plans for dealing with Russian aggression. Biden will then head to Helsinki on Thursday, where he will celebrate the expansion of NATO with Finland as the newest member. Rishi Sunak has reiterated that the UK is signatory to a convention that prohibits cluster munitions after the US agreed to supply Ukraine with the controversial weapons. On Saturday, 8 people were killed and 13 injured in Lyman in eastern Ukraine after the town centre came under Russian rocket fire. The strikes hit around 10 a.m. local time at 2 intersections that were busy with pedestrians. A residential building, an annex to a printing house, and 3 cars were set on fire in the attack. Mercenary fighters from Yevgeny Prigogin's Wagner group are preparing to move to Belarus under the terms of a deal that defused their mutiny against Russia's military leadership. The exact whereabouts of Prigozhin is still unclear. Poland began moving more than 1,000 troops and almost 200 units of equipment to the east of the country on Saturday, amid rising concern that the presence of Wagner fighters in Belarus could lead to increased tension on its border. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has secured Turkey's crucial backing for Ukraine's pledge to join NATO during his meeting with Erdogan in Istanbul. NATO leaders will publicly recommit to Ukraine at some point becoming a member of the military alliance when they meet in Vilnius on Tuesday. President Zelensky has visited Snake Island, a symbol of his country's defiance early in the war after Ukrainian soldiers there refused to surrender to Russian forces. That's to mark the 500 days since the invasion. The UN's International Atomic Energy Authority has said it was making progress on inspecting several areas of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant after Ukraine claimed that external objects similar to explosive devices had been placed on rooftops at the site. So that was quite a lengthy Ukraine update there. Usually I would ask yourselves if there's anything that struck you or stood out there, but there's quite a lot of other interesting items that I'd really like to get on with, because we often end up running out of time. Yeah, of course, Sandra, yeah.
Just shortly, basically the Ukraine situation, I think we all agree it's an awful situation. Cluster bombs, 100 countries, are against them, so I'm really concerned about that. But one of the other issues I was concerned about, I saw a CNN interview with President Biden, and it was about NATO. And he says that he thinks NATO is not ready and Ukraine is not ready to join NATO. But he also said that the US would basically give to Ukraine's security the same as they have done to Israel. And I think it's something perhaps it's worth looking at. What exactly does President Biden mean by that? And why are they not able to join Ukraine at the moment? That was two issues I just wanted to raise.
Thank you for that, Sandra. Martyn, is there anything that you can maybe contribute to that and to answer Sandra's question?
I to be perfectly honest, I don't know the answer. I do think there's an awful lot more we need to be doing on the whole Ukrainian situation, and while we would all support them, I think some of the UK's foreign policy is perhaps failing us, because we should be taking a tougher stance on countries like Iran that are supplying arms and munitions to Russia. So I think there's a few more things we need to be adding into that pot as well.
Yeah, I suppose the one thing we can be certain of is it's going to be in the news for quite a long time to come before there's any resolution. So I'll move on to our first item, which is climate change. So this June just past has been the hottest June ever in the UK. There have been record temperatures in Texas, I think up to 50 degrees I've seen reported elsewhere, and in China. The Climate Change Committee has said that the UK has lost its place as a world leader on the issue. Apparently the UK government is drawing up plans to drop the UK's flagship £11.6 billion climate and nature funding pledge, with the Prime Minister in the process being accused of betraying those populations that are most vulnerable to global warming. He's been accused by some of those countries of making false promises. Reasons given for the change in policy included an elite briefing to ministers said that our commitment to double our international climate finance to £11.6 billion was made in 2019, when we were still at 0.7% of GDP on international aid, and that was pre-COVID. It went on to say that to meet the commitment by the deadline would be a huge challenge because of new pressures, including aid for Ukraine being included in the aid budget. Small island states will be left feeling utterly betrayed by this. And given that around 25 Commonwealth countries are small island states, it seems the UK's reputation as a reliable partner has been shredded in this respect. So, Sandra, I'd like to ask you, the UK's reputation has been trashed by the Climate Change Committee, and at the moment Scotland is lumped in with the UK. So technically our reputation on climate change is also being trashed. Does Scotland deserve that?
I don't think Scotland does deserve that, because obviously we're moving forward in green energy, and if we had the powers of a normal, independent state, we could do so much more in it, particularly regarding, the oil and the gas and fracking, etc., which, obviously the Westminster government, the Tories and Labour, because they haven't, said they would go back on that one, basically are determined to push forward. And that's just obviously in the UK. There's obviously the anti-protest bill, which is, really going to hit hard on people who are protesting against, what they're actually doing in regards to climate change. And as for internationally, well, I think the UK reputation has been trashed for a number of reasons, not just obviously the climate change and reversing decisions that they have already made. I mean, you consider that the UK was always the one who said that the Commonwealth, particularly the late Queen, the Commonwealth is so important to us, and yet these very countries which we say we support, basically we are trashing them as well. We're going back on their promises. I mean, you see, as you had mentioned, Brian, the situation in the rest of the world. You just need to look at some parts of Europe. Spain, for instance, record flooding, places, which, Valencia, Murcia, places which lots of tourists go to. So it's not as if it's not known that climate change is causing this. But yeah, as far as I'm concerned, I think you can see the way it's going. Yeah, the reputation has been trashed, and it really is indefensible that they're cutting, climate change monies and monies internationally as well. It just doesn't get, not just a reputation any good, but it's not helping these countries who are finding it very, very hard to cope.
Thanks, Sandra. And Martyn, as an MP, you move around in the corridors in Westminster. Can you give us any idea about how this news was received in London?
Well, I mean, I can certainly tell you, those of us who have who believe we have a moral duty to look after the rest of the world, particularly when they've suffered at many of the toxic emissions that those of us in the West have produced, feel that this is a complete and utter betrayal of many of the vulnerable. I mean, if you look at African countries alone, they reckon by 2030, I think it's put at something like 2.8 trillion is required. So even the previous level of funding was falling well short of the level of support that was needed. So we're absolutely failing, and it does look like we're just pandering to some of the worst elements of big business. If you take the Shell chief executive, for example, I mean, they've gone back on their attempts to cut back on fossil fuel extraction purely to exploit profits backed on the war in Ukraine. And I'm afraid the UK government just isn't taking steps to hit them a windfall tax that we could then be using to help develop our own renewable energy sector. And we should be doing a lot more to invest in community energy. The future is renewable. You know, we've got to deal with that at home, and we've got to help others elsewhere in the world that have suffered from the emissions that we've helped produce.
Thanks, Martyn. So a wee bit more on that Climate Change Committee report, which was withering to say the least. It said that targets are being missed on nearly every front. Fewer homes were insulated last year under government-backed schemes than the year before, and despite soaring energy bills and cost of living crisis, there's little progress on transport emissions. No coherent programme for behaviour change, and still no decision on hydrogen for home heating. Meanwhile, the installation of new wind and solar farms and upgrading the electricity grid are still too slow to meet net zero, according to the Climate Change Committee. And yet at COP26 in Glasgow, Boris Johnson, who was Prime Minister at the time, said that we were just 2 minutes from midnight in terms of climate change. So now, how does it look? With Rishi Sunak in charge, who seems to have no interest in climate change at all. Should we believe Johnson when he said that if Boris Johnson was still Prime Minister, would we be meeting our climate change targets? Martyn, I'll ask you first.
Well, I think history and experience has taught us not to believe anything that Boris Johnson said. In some respects, he was correct. We need to be doing something, but I have no confidence in this UK government to actually deliver. And the reality of the Tories that we are seeing on a day-to-day basis, they have obsessions about nuclear modular reactors, and they're not looking, in my opinion, at the correct agenda of transitioning, a just transition and getting renewable technology. They've been years behind, and that's why we're now paying the penalties of that in higher energy bills.
Thanks, Martyn. And Sandra, as you were an MSP in Holyrood, I'm just thinking the Bute House agreement that the SNP has with the Green Party and their cooperation. Do you think is it working? Is it a good thing, or how does it look in Scotland in respect to this?
I think it is a good thing, but we've got to remember that green policies, environmental policies, was one of our chief pledges. I mean, the SNP were there at the forefront even before the Green Party in regards to green energy and the environment as well. So yeah, I think it has worked. I know a lot of people say, oh, the Green Party, they'll push and push and push. Well, I mean, that's their agenda. And if it means if you're talking, you know, if the First Minister is talking with the ministers of the Green Party, they'll come to some form of compromise. And it can only be a good thing for the country. The biggest thing that's holding us back is that we don't have the purse strings in that regard to be able to pursue the policies we want. So yeah, I think the environment has been forgotten for far too long. And Martyn made a very good point in regards to the fact that we, the West, are the polluters, particularly in the African countries. And I think that's an important point. We can say and do things, but we're just pushing our rubbish, as you might want to call it, onto these poorer countries, and then we're cutting any aid to them. And I think that's a very important point. I'm sure the Scottish Government, along with the Green Party, will raise that as well. And it has to be raised as much as possible. So yeah, I think the compromise with the Green Party and the SNP is a good one. Push forward the environmental policies.
Thanks, Sandra. So with that, I'll move on to our next item. So the SNP has slammed the Labour Party for their U-turn on abolishing the abhorrent two-child benefit cap, despite numerous senior Labour figures condemning the policy in recent years. This two-child benefit cap is otherwise known as the rape clause. Since the Tories introduced the policy, Sir Keir Starmer published the following on his website: scrap the inhumane work capability assessments and private provision of disability assessments, pledged to scrap punitive sanctions, two-child limits and benefits caps. And Sarwar has been known to say this is the party that introduced the rape clause, which is a horrific piece of legislation within their welfare reforms. Mr Sarwar also said, in addition, we will use the full extent of the Scottish Parliament powers, as well as working with the UK colleagues, to abolish the two-child cap, scrap the rape clause and make split payments. Ian Murray said, we could have debated universal credit and the £20 uplift becoming permanent, extending it to legacy benefits and removing the rape clause and helping those most in need. Wes Streeting has also said things against the rape clause, as has Jonathan Ashworth. What can I say? Martyn.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose nothing surprises me now. We're at that stage that there's been so many Labour reversals and U-turns that you really have to wonder, well, what do they stand for? Do they stand for anything? Is it just a carbon copy of the Tories attempting to get power? I've said this on a number of occasions that I think the Tories are so abhorrent and they're so underhand that they're now openly masquerading as the Labour Party to win the next general election. And that is where we are. I mean, the list of betrayals and reversals is shocking. I mean, Starmer presented himself as sort of Corbyn light to win the Labour Party leadership, and they've just been ditching those positions, and they're going even further to the right now as they're trying to attract this voter from Middle England. And I think that should be telling to people in Scotland that whatever happens, the opinions of a fairly right-wing section of the electorate in England will dictate the policies of the UK, and we need to get out of there as fast as we possibly can.
Thanks, Martyn. Sandra, I don't know if you had a chance to see Monica Lennon's tweet on the subject. As she were an MSP in Holyrood, she said, I know colleagues are scared of deselection, being exiled to backbenches or not winning selections, but if we don't speak out, then who will? The two-child benefit cap, aka the rape clause, is abhorrent and must be scrapped. UK Labour policies must be progressive and humane. I'm guessing you would agree with her in that.
Yeah, absolutely, Brian. I must admit, when I was elected in the Parliament, I would chat to Monica. Basically, I always find her pretty decent. Do you call it on the left, or just a decent person who would support me in certain things, and I would support her also. So good on her for coming out and telling the truth, because the real cause of all this is because it's Middle England, and you had the Brexit Party, now Farage, etc. It all started from there, and the Tories became more right wing to challenge Farage, and then Labour, they started going right wing as well. Basically, all the principles out of the window just to get elected in Middle England, and we're stuck now with this Tory government, and the Labour Party are just red Tories as far as I'm concerned. And you go back to the rape clause, the situation in the Scottish Parliament regarding mitigating these things. It's a hard choice at the beginning, because obviously it's a lot of money out of our budget which we get from Westminster, and we can't continue to mitigate everything that comes from Westminster, which is bad. We had the debate in the Parliament in regards to that, and for Labour to turn their backs on it, I mean, let's look at it. I think Martyn said there's a long list there as well. I mean, they believe in Brexit. They even believe in the Tories' immigration and migration policy as well. They won't, turn back the clock on student fees. So basically, what do they stand for, actually? And if you were anybody, Monica Lennon, I see the other MSP, Mercedes, can't remember her second name, unfortunately, I apologise for that. There's quite a few in the Labour Party MSPs who are very uncomfortable with the way Labour has went. And if you're true to your principles and you say you stood for election to help people or change things, then the decent thing is to be like Monica and stand up and be heard. Because this isn't a Labour Party which I remember from my father's days, and most people don't remember either. And really, they're just throwing everything, baby out with the bathwater, to get elected in Middle England. And then you'll just have the same roundabout again. And they get in, they get out, Tories come in. So the people of Scotland have got to wake up, and basically, the media's got to wake up as well and start reporting the truth for a change instead of just sound bites.
Thanks, Sandra. Yeah, I think you may have come up with a wee soundbite there, or a slogan that Labour should listen to. Be like Monica. No, not at all. Be like Monica is a good point. Martyn, I'd like to come back to something that you said, and Sandra touched on it as well. This idea that Labour, UK Labour Party, they seem more interested in recapturing the red wall votes in the north of England. Does that mean that they've now realised that they don't have to care anything about Scotland and they can just do whatever they want because they don't need our votes anymore?
I think the reality is Scotland is an afterthought to the British parties, irrespective of their colours. We will get what they decide for England because that's where British general elections will be won or lost. Scotland is almost ancillary to that. The number of occasions where the outcome in Scotland has made a difference are few and far between. And that will be the case until we get our own independence and leave them to it.
Thanks, Martyn. And Sandra, just before we leave this item, I'd just like to say that the rape clause, correct me if I'm wrong, it is one of the things that is mitigated in Holyrood by the SNP Green government. Were you there when that was put in place? Can you tell us something about that?
Yes, I was. I spoke in that debate as well, and I remember calling out a couple of the Tories, Labour were apparently against it at the time, calling out a couple of Tories when it was brought in. Bruce Davison was one of them. And one of the things that I did mention was the fact that I come from a big family. There's 9 of us. I've got 6 brothers and 2 sisters. And I put forward to Annie Wells, I think it was at the time, the fact that if this rape clause had been in, probably some of my family wouldn't have been born. Certainly you wouldn't have a house, you wouldn't have, what would you have done? It would go way back to the days where if you were staying in a tenement property, you had these guys that would come along and chalk up on the closes how many people were supposed to be in the flats at that time. It was horrific. And I remember speaking in that debate, as did many, many others. And it's just disgraceful that they can bring something in like that. I mean, you look at the human cost, but when you look at the cost to, obviously, the Scottish Parliament and mitigating it, there's also cost to housing associations, basically, because they don't mitigate it, but they can't raise rents as much, etc., etc. So it's cost them a lot of money. A lot of them basically were in debt because people could not pay this extra charge of the rape clause. That's why it had to be mitigated. So there's lots and lots of issues in there, but they just don't seem to care. They just don't care.
Thank you, Sandra. So I'll maybe move on to the next item then, which is a drug law reform proposals being put forward by the Scottish Government. There's been a call for decriminalisation of drugs. Decriminalisation of all drugs for personal supply is one of a number of policies which the Scottish Government is calling on the UK Government to implement in a new paper on drug law reform. The move would allow people found in possession of drugs to be treated and supported rather than criminalised and excluded. Decriminalisation would also mean that without a criminal record, people in recovery would have a better chance of employment. The document's been published by the Scottish Government outlining measures which could be implemented through further devolution, independence or changes enacted immediately by the UK Government to support the work being done within existing powers to reduce drug deaths. Among the proposals are decriminalisation of all drugs for personal supply progressed as part of a wider review of drug laws, immediate legislative changes to allow the Scottish Government to fully and properly implement harm reduction measures such as supervised drug consumption facilities, and drug checking and increased access to the life-saving drug naloxone. There's also a roadmap for further exploration of drug law reform, focusing on evidence and the reduction of harm, including an update of drug classification system to be based on harms caused. Dr. Eleanor Whittam, MSP, said, "These are ambitious and radical proposals grounded in evidence that will help save lives. We want to create a society where problematic drug use is treated as a health, not a criminal matter." So, Martyn, I'll come to you first. Do you think that these proposals, well, Rishi Sunak is already, or a spokesperson for the Conservative government has already said that they will not agree to this, and you're the SNP's spokesperson on health. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I think they've been very short-sighted and stupid in that approach. I think this is an excellent set of proposals that came out of the Scottish Government to tackle a problem that is here with us in every community, and unfortunately it has been growing at a fairly steady rate. I mean, since before the Scottish Parliament was created, it's gone up, I think, 5 times the number of drug deaths that we have each year in Scotland. So we have a real problem. The existing situation isn't working, and this is a radical but sane approach to try and change that. I've worked with some local groups in my constituency where people have been dealing with people who have been addicts, and people's lives can be ruined by going through a cycle of imprisonment and criminal records, and it takes there's a lot of work needing done to get people where they need to be. And if you make it harder and you stigmatise them, we're not helping, we're not saving people. And this approach would save people. So I think it really has to be welcomed, and it just shows how short-sighted the UK is. They look at a situation which they've presided over for decades that's not worked, and they're not looking at the solutions.
Thanks, Mark. That's actually something that I'd like to come back to, so remind me if I forget, and it's in relation to Anas Sarwar's response to this proposal. But Sandra, I'll come to you, because again, you've been your previous role as an MSP. This to me sounds like Holyrood wants to tackle the drugs deaths issue in the same way that they tackled knife crime, treating it as a health policy rather than a violence policy. That would you agree with that? And again, as you were probably a member at the time when knife crime was being tackled, maybe you can give us some insight in how it might relate to this topic.
No, I think it is a health issue, and obviously Portugal, for instance, have done it, and look how the drug deaths have completely plummeted there. So there's examples of how well it works. But yeah, when you come to the knife crime one, I mean, that's been very successful. And that was the Violence Reduction Unit as well, who done a fantastic job going out to speak to people. I was on the Justice Committee as well. We go out to speak to people, going to prisons, speak to some of the young offenders, women as well as men, not just young, who obviously had a drug problem, and trying to find out how we could help them, basically. And all of this, and we took all of that back and looked through it all. And, Martyn's, absolutely right when he mentions about the, having it on your record. That's how half of them ended up in prison. And I remember one, if I may be allowed to say this, I was speaking to a young chap in Liddy prison. And he told me that he was trying to be clean. And when they got out, one of the things is they went back to the same environment, unfortunately. That's changing now. I must admit, they've got mentors now, buddies they call them. And he stayed in his house for a couple of days, and then an envelope came through the letterbox. And he went out to see what it was, and it was the drug dealers. This is how they get them in. And the boy succumbed and took more drugs, and then they were back at his door a couple of days later, demanding money, so he had to go out in the streets and rob to pay these drug dealers off. And it's a vicious circle. So yeah, being able to use it as a health issue and not have a police record is something that, I just don't understand. Well, I can understand why Westminster don't want to do it, because they don't want Scotland to be successful in anything. But the one thing I can't understand, and it's not just on this issue, why is it that parties from, other political parties can't see this as, and you're going to go back about Anas Sarwar, as you said, can't see this as a success for the people. Never mind the politics of it, the humanity of it. And yet it just seems it doesn't matter what the SNP government does, they're against it. And that's something that they should be deeply ashamed of that. There's people dying every day, and Scotland has a particular problem, and it's mostly, street drugs, tablets, Valium, that type of thing, mixed with who knows what, and we want to tackle it in the way that we see the environment here, not the way we see it in Westminster or anything like that. So yeah, I mean, it's something that has to come in, and I will commend my colleagues in Westminster. They work very, very closely, and I know Martyn and Alison Thewlis and that have raised it umpteen times. And this is a place where good working together actually hopefully will have a good outcome, because obviously Westminster has to deal with it because of the Drugs Act, and we want to deal with it in a health issue as well.
Thank you, Sandra. Just a wee bit more information on this. Eleanor Whittam, the Drugs Policy Minister, actually made this announcement flanked by key members of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which is holding its AGM in Edinburgh, was the other day. And the evidence that the Scottish Government has based its proposal on is that of Portugal. This is from Professor Robertson's Talking Up Scotland website, by the way, which I'd like to give him a credit for here. He said that in Portugal, decriminalisation of drugs was made 22 years ago in 2001, and that has resulted in the rates of drug use have remained consistently below the EU average. The proportion of prisoners sentenced for drug use has fallen from 40% to 15%. Drug-related deaths have remained below the EU average since decriminalisation in 2001. So what I'm thinking is, even so, considering the success in Portugal, you can kind of understand why people might be concerned about drugs being decriminalised. They'll be worried about increased drug use. But you can answer that if possible, but I'm also keen to get back to that point I was going to say, Martyn, about Anis Sarwar's response, because he said that drug deaths in Scotland are higher than in England, and yet we've got the same policies because it's reserved, so therefore Scotland should be able to do better with what we've got already. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think we're doing as much as we can. I mean, there's two. I mean, in this almost every health debate I take part in, I point out that there's a clear link between health inequalities and poverty, and it's exactly the same with the drug use. It tends to be areas where poverty have a higher usage and more problems. So, unless we get the full economic fiscal powers to run our own country, we're going to have a poverty issue and a health inequality issue, and that knock-on effect will be a drug issue. So I think our guys in Edinburgh are doing everything they can, and this policy highlights this is a way out of the mess. So we should be grabbing it with both hands and saving people.
Thank you, Martyn. So I've got a response from the Prime Minister's spokesperson, Rishi Sunak's spokesperson, on Friday afternoon. They shot down the drug reform proposals while admitting that they had not seen Holyrood's report, which kind of bolsters arguments about Westminster's unthinking intransigence. Sandra, I've got a minute or so left. Have you got anything that you can add to that?
Well, I think I'll reiterate the point that I made in regards to the difference in, Martyn's already mentioned about, poverty and that as well. But the situation in Scotland is different from the situation in England. It's not, it's more street drugs. That is the biggest problem. These street opiates, tablets, are being made in houses. Nobody knows what's in them. Blue, pink, whatever colour it is. That's our biggest problem. That's where we have the problem. Not so much the injection, heroin, etc. It's street drugs. And that's why we need control over that, because it's endemic, unfortunately. Particularly I live in the city centre in Glasgow. You see it nearly every day, basically. And it's street Valium, made in houses. That's the biggest cause of our drug deaths here in Scotland. And it's got to be looked in a Scotland-wide manner, not in a UK-wide manner.
Thank you, Sandra. I'll maybe move on to our next item, unless there's one last thing that you might want to add, Martyn. Or...
No, I think it just highlights, the situation that England says no without, looking at the real problem. And the only way around that for us, and we need to highlight it to the public, is that we need the full powers to get on and do stuff for ourselves, because we can see the solution and we can tackle the problem.
Thank you, Martyn. So I'll move on to the next item then, which is the National Health Service. The National Health Service must undergo radical change or it will continue to decline and lose public support, Tony Blair has argued on the service's 75th anniversary. It must reshape its relationship with patients and make much more use of private healthcare, he said. Private healthcare funders should be used to cut waiting times. The former Labour Prime Minister has said the prevalence of chronic health conditions, long waiting times, the NHS's stretched workforce and tight public finances in the years ahead mean the service must transform how it operates, he said. The NHS now requires fundamental reform or eventually support, or for it will diminish, as in the 1990s the NHS must either change or decline. He writes in the foreword to a new report from the Tony Blair Institute think tank, which sets out the ideas for safeguarding the NHS's future. On 6 occasions in his foreword, Blair backs the private sector playing an expanded role. When he was Prime Minister, Blair used private sector treatment centres to tackle long waiting lists, but Dr John Puntis, the co-chair of the campaign group Keep Our NHS Public, urged caution on Blair's ideas, saying caring is about people, and although technology supports healthcare, it can never be a magic bullet and replace the need for staff. So, Martyn, as the SNP's health spokesperson, I don't really have a question for you, but just a couple of things that I was going to say by the way. Tony Blair, he's a member of the Order of the Garter, and when that was announced, he said that he will be Sir Tony rather than Sir Anthony, as if that would make him show that he's a man of the people, when actually he's a multimillionaire, and he now advocates private healthcare. So what was it Margaret Thatcher said? Her greatest achievement was Sir Anthony Blair.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, where do you start on this one? I think if we reduce it to sort of first principle fundamentals, it's maybe the best place to start from. The situation that our health service is in is a result of political choices. And there's a reason we've got understaffing and affordability issues, and it's because it's been underfunded in England. That has a knock-on effect for us in Scotland, despite which we've still managed to fund our health service better. We've got more consultants, we've got more nurses, we've got more GPs per head of population, we've got a higher spend per head of population, and we've managed to resist the privatisation agenda to a much greater extent. But we're vulnerable to what happens in the UK, and the issues like the UK Internal Markets Act could see us opened up at the stroke of a minister's pen to privatised competition from America. It is a frightening position for us to be in, and of course both the UK parties are now wedded to the whole concept of Brexit, which has compounded staffing shortages issues, which has a knock-on effect on our health service. So it comes down to political choices. We can make different and better choices for ourselves, and that's what we have to do. And I think just this week, Michael Matheson's demonstrated that with the work he's done on the junior doctors' pay settlement, getting agreement with the BMA. So hopefully that comes to a satisfactory conclusion. But it shows you that where there's a political will and a political choice to be made, we can make better choices that are more in keeping with our people.
Thank you, Martyn. And so, Sandra, from everything that Martyn said there, that long list of things that he gave where things are different in Scotland, we should be thanking you for that, as you were in Holyrood at the time.
Well, thank you. My colleagues as well, but I agree with everything that Martyn has said, and Brexit has had a huge impact on the way the health services are operating at the moment. I mean, I was on the health committee. That was my last committee before I retired, basically, and the cost and improbability of even getting insulin with Brexit. Our committee time is taken up with loads and loads of legislation, pieces of paper, trying to work out DEFRA, etc., etc. So you've got to look at basically Brexit in that context as well. That held up an awful lot of stuff that was going through to hospitals, etc., etc. I think everyone knows that now. But the biggest problem is the privatisation creeping in to the health service. And that's what they want to do. They want to privatise it. I have never seen so many adverts on social media for private healthcare. Constant, never used to get it, constant private healthcare. Basically, it's seeping in, and that is a big problem. People are seeing it now it's seeping in. In regards to, Scottish NHS, I think we have done a great job. I know that we had to use, private companies to take the waiting list down, and that's something that had to happen after COVID, etc., etc. And it's just something we had to do. But we would never go down the line of privatisation. And when you look at how forward we've been, and the minimum pricing and how that's helped, particularly with alcohol, obviously, and the long-term effects of that, and people who have had long-term illnesses through alcohol, that's been a great success. But you look at the media, you wouldn't think it. Basically, a couple of wee shots in the paper, and that's it. So we're targeting things, as I said previously, with the drug situation. We're targeting things in our health service based on what we know, and we know best how our people are being reacted to. I mean, there's a lot of people who have varying degrees of health problems, but I must admit, when I was going around visiting the hospitals, I was amazed at the amount of work, and I'm so pleased we managed to, give the pay rise to the NHS and the consultants, etc. as well. No strikes, as Martyn had already mentioned. But one of the big things that's came in as well is the use of pharmacies and giving them that little bit more power. Basically, power is probably the wrong word. Be more involved in the NHS, and it's great. You can go to your pharmacy, which is on your doorstep. That's what the people want. We did a consultation with the public, and they wanted to be able to go to somewhere nearer and not necessarily, they did complain about doctors and the hours they worked. Why didn't they work weekends and things like that? So you can go to your pharmacy and you can get your blood tested. You go to your pharmacy, you can get various, consultations there as well. So I think, the improvements that's came there has certainly enabled more people to get treatment, and the pharmacy and optometrists as well. Basically, they're doing great work. They're doing great work, and it doesn't get publicised enough that it's easier to get there. And if there's something really wrong, they will refer you. They will refer you to the eye hospital or tell you to go to the hospital, etc. So I think we're doing things on the ground which people appreciate, but perhaps doesn't get highlighted enough.
Thank you, Sandra. What was, there's that word mitigation again, isn't there? The health is reserved. Health is devolved to Edinburgh, and yet there was something that you said which I was going to come back on, but it's gone. But oh, I know what it was. Yeah, you're right, Sandra, that it is creeping in up here. I noticed that there's a big private healthcare clinic opened up on Sucky Hall Street, and it proclaims it above the door that it's quite proud that it's private. It says that in its actual title, and it looks quite substantial. But that fact that although health is reserved, the spending on the NHS in England directly impacts on what money Scotland gets to spend in its NHS here. But Martyn, again, I'm thinking, going back to Westminster, when Labour was in power, Tony Blair, as we started the piece with, Labour did spend a lot more on the NHS. Public satisfaction was at its highest with the NHS, and yet he did, send people to private hospitals to cut down on waiting lists. Do you think it is possible, or is it right to use private healthcare to square that circle of the public sector?
I think I've got two sort of thoughts here. One, we need to make sure that the health sector is properly resourced and funded to cope with our needs and the demands. And obviously one of the big issues is we've got to tackle the sort of prevention agenda to stop people getting ill in the first place, and make sure that it's manageable. When we get situations where it isn't possible to treat everyone quick enough, I think you have to bite the bullet and say, well, if there is capacity there, buy it in and help save people's lives, or in quality of their lives, is absolutely critical. So I think in emergency type situations, yes, I could support that, but really we have to make sure we're in a position where we don't need to do that, and that is very much a last resort.
Thank you, Martyn. So I'll move on to the next item, if that's okay with both of you. So on Friday, it was Humza Yousaf's 100th day in office. He has been busy, we should find out, and he hasn't crashed the economy either, the way that Liz Truss did in 44 days when she was outlasted by a lettuce. Humza Yousaf reaches 100 days as First Minister last week, and many would agree his public profile is not as strong as his predecessors was. He's quiet compared to Miss Sturgeon's feisty nature. He's the youngest First Minister, he's the first Asian First Minister and the first Muslim First Minister, both achievements in their own right, and his cabinet is the first to have a female majority. Yousaf has faced a turbulent early tenure. There's been a slump in the polls for the SNP, although support for independence is held. Scrutiny of the SNP governance and transparency. There's been the arrests of Miss Sturgeon, her husband, the then party's chief executive, Peter Morrell, and the party's then treasurer, Colin Beattie. All have been released without charge, but as the old saying goes, mud sticks. Polling suggests a decoupling of party support from constitutional preferences, that the SNP is going down in the polls, but independence remains high when the two used to go side by side. I've got quite a long list that I should maybe try and go through. Despite being seen as a continuity candidate in the leadership race since he took office, Yousaf has scrapped or substantially revised a series of Miss Sturgeon's previous government policies. The highly protected marine areas have been delayed, deposit return schemes been delayed, alcohol advertising has gone back to the drawing board, the National Care Service has been delayed, gender reform bill, there's been no change, the de facto referendum has been revised, and drug criminalisation is new and was made on Yousaf's 100th day. Shona Robson, the Deputy First Minister with responsibility for key finance portfolio, said that they had committed £15 million of funding to deliver free after-school and holiday clubs for children. The SNP have tripled the Fuel Insecurity Fund, which helps those struggling with energy costs, from £10 million last year to £30 million this year. Mr Yousaf's first external event as First Minister was to attend the STUC Congress, where he pledged to oppose the Tories' strikes bill. He also chaired a summit aimed at tackling poverty in Scotland. There's a new 10-year cancer strategy has been published. An updated plan for treating stroke patients has been published. He signed, I'm going as fast as I can here to get as many in as possible before we come back to both of you. He set up a new deal for business group to reset Holyrood's relationship with businesses. He signed a new agreement with Scotland's 32 local councils, COSLA, to reset the Holyrood's relationship with councils. He decided not to suspend Nicola Sturgeon from the party, despite pressure to do so from opposition. He launched the fourth white paper in a Building a New Scotland series, focusing on a written constitution for Scotland. He said the SNP agreement with the Greens, the Butte House agreement, would stand as it's worth its weight in gold. There's been the SNP Independence Convention, which welcomes speakers who are not SNP supporters, one of whom we had on here last week, George McIntyre Kemp, or a couple of weeks ago now, who supports a wellbeing economy, and the convention is going to be followed by a series of regional assemblies. First Minister reneged on a commitment to attend an upcoming AUOB rally in Stirling as it clashed with the coronation, and First Minister and previous Health Secretary Humza Yousaf then averted strikes by nurses, ambulance staff and now junior doctors. Sandra, I'll come to you first. I'm so sorry for rattling through that at a rate of knots, but I felt that we had to show just how much he has gotten through. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad I didn't need to read all that list out. I must admit, I would have forgotten some of them. It's quite an achievement in, 100 days. Basically, you mentioned at the beginning that obviously his predecessor, Nicola, being more feisty. But I think Humza is pretty feisty as well. I've watched some First Minister's questions, and it doesn't stand any nonsense. So I think he's came out, he's had a lot to cope with, as you mentioned, and I won't get into all of that. But, I think he's his own person, and he's showing that now as well. So there's a feistiness there too, but there's also the ability to listen and talk to people. And one of the areas that I did, and I'm glad you mentioned it, is the deal that they've made with COSLA. They've signed, actually. They've signed, I can't remember the exact title that it's got, which will give local councils more flexibility, and also with the flexibility comes more responsibility too. I think could be a real game changer in this whole thing, because local councils, when we're talking about, care, social care, which I think you mentioned as well in a previous question, social care is delivered by local councils, and then you've also got the health service as well. So if we can get them working together, I would hope social care could push forward. The wellbeing economy as well. I mean, local councils do a very, very important job, and councillors do too. I don't think they get paid enough, councillors, but maybe that's a topic for another part of it. But you know, they're really down there at the grassroots, dealing with people, and some of the stuff they get is, you know, is undeserved. But if we've got this new deal between the government and local and COSLA, and there's a flexibility in it, and they can say what that flexibility is, and they can work together, and I think it could be a real game changer. And that's one of the things that I'm really, really pleased about, that they have signed this agreement, anyway, this deal, because I think there's lots and lots of things that could happen if they've got the flexibility to deliver for each area, different area. I mean, Martyn comes obviously from a different area from me, although Falkirk's not, some parts are not unlike some of Glasgow, basically. So every council has their own priorities. If they get the flexibility to spend money on the priorities they see, well, I think that can only be a good thing, and I hope that the media and that will push that, because that's the one thing we've been up against from the very beginning, is the media have really had a full-on onslaught about anything good that comes out of the SNP, and for me, this deal with COSLA is one of the best things that will come out of it.
Thanks, Sandra. So, Martyn, I'm intrigued. How did the election of Humza Yousaf as First Minister land in Westminster, and these achievements that we've been rattling through? Did they register at all down there?
Well, I think, you know, it's pretty much it landed with us the same way it landed with everyone else in the party. I think we were certainly all surprised at the sudden resignation that Nicola made, and disappointed in that as well. We found ourselves in a leadership contest, perhaps without a clear succession strategy, and I think it's been to everybody's credit that we've came through that. And I have to say, I've been very impressed with what I've seen from Humza. I've been tuning in to watch, usually after the event, the First Minister's questions when I'm on the way home on the train, and he's been delivering really strong and good performances. It's been unfortunate that some of his performances have been overshadowed by other events and a hostile media, but you know, there's a lot of really good work that's been done. I think this 100-day marker allows us to highlight that, and it's our job to get those messages out to the public that, you know, there's a lot of really good work being done, particularly on anti-poverty, health inequalities, creating a fairer society. But you know, we can't just do that by mitigating what Westminster does to us. We need the full powers of independence to do it for ourselves, and you know, we've got a job to do to get that message out there and evangelise on the doorsteps.
Thank you, Martyn. Sandra, I don't know if you were able to attend the SNP Independence Conference. It was up in Aberdeen, Dundee recently. Yeah, but there was that incredible moment when there was a heckler early on when the First Minister was giving his opening speech, and he took, instead of having her ejected from the auditorium, he went to speak to her. Were you there? Did you?
Yes, I went along, and I met a lot of colleagues that were there also. I went along because basically I wanted to hear what Humza had to say about how we're moving forward for independence. And I took a speaker's card, because if I had heard something that, you know, I didn't agree with, I would have got up and spoke. But I agreed with everything he said, and I thought he did it marvellously. And the point with the lady who spoke, or heckle, whatever you want to call it, certainly I thought it was wonderful, because, you know, we know that security, etc., but Humza decided absolutely not. I'm going down. Some people had in the audience had booed, who were there, and Humza told them no. If somebody's got something to say, we have to listen to them. So we shouldn't be doing that. And he went down off the stage and called a halt to the conference at that point, and went along and spoke to the lady. Spoke to her for about 10 minutes, and walked along out. And I know that he met with her afterwards as well. And you know, that was off his own back. He wasn't advised to do it or anything. He decided he was going to do that. And I've never really seen any other, leader of any party doing that, deciding, no, I'm going to go and speak to this lady. We couldn't really hear what she was saying because she was away at the side, basically. But yeah, no, good on him. I thought he did very well. It showed you how much he appreciates people being there, and whether it interrupted or not, it didn't bother him. He went down, spoke to her, and then came back up the stage and says, okay, let's get back to what we were saying previous to it. Yeah, and it went down very, very well, obviously, because it showed a humanity. That's what it showed. She's a human being, he's a human being. She had a very serious point to get across, and he was willing to stop the conference and go and speak to her. I thought it was wonderful, and everyone else did as well. And I came away from Dundee thinking, we're on the right track. We're on the right track.
That's great, Sandra. Thank you. I'm maybe just going to take a few minutes to talk about something else that's come out in the news, which was the resignation of Mary Black this week. Well, she's not resigned, but she said she's not going to stand at the next election. So she became the youngest MP in 350 years when she was elected in the SNP landslide of 2015 at the age of 20. In the process, she ousted Shadow Foreign Secretary Douglas Alexander. He had a 16,614 majority with Mary Black took his place with a 16,614 majority. That was a 26.9% swing. She was speaking to the Newsagents podcast the other day, and she said Westminster was one of the most unhealthy workplaces you could ever be in, and that's why she decided to step down at the next general election. She said, honestly, because I'm tired is a big part of it, and the thing that makes me tired is Westminster. She used the word toxic. She said it was a poisonous place, not a nice place to be in. Instead, it gave her the ick. My colleague in the control room, forgive me, I was supposed to queue up a short clip that we've got of Mary Black speaking at a rally in Glasgow about the rape clause, and we were supposed to use it earlier on in our discussion about the rape clause, but I forgot to do that. But I think maybe we can play it now so that we can see the quality of Mary Black's rhetoric, and we'll come back and have a wee chat about it.
Now, every time we raise these sorts of issues in the House of Commons, the answer we get from the Prime Minister is that it was the Conservative Party that gave the UK their first female Prime Minister, that it was the Conservative Party that gave the UK the second female Prime Minister. But let me say very clearly, as a woman, your gender doesn't matter a jot if you use it to kick away the ladder for other women.
The indubitable Mary Black. So the First Minister said that she called her a trailblazer, and Nicola Sturgeon said that her words resonated and that we need more Marys, not fewer. Martyn, you were same intake as Mary in 2015. How did it? What was it like when you heard the news?
I will admit I was a little surprised, although on reflection, I think it's fair to say that none of us have particularly enjoyed our time at Westminster, and I know that was certainly Mary's view. So perhaps it wasn't that surprising. And with this being not a sudden snap election like the previous ones, people have had time to reflect on, do I really want to do another 5 years potentially, or can I now bow out and give people time to get other candidates in place? And a lot of people are making, sensible decisions. That she's absolutely spot on when she says it's toxic. It's very disruptive to family life. It's very punishing on your health and for a lot of our colleagues' age and health. I mean, I had some health issues last year. I'm pleased to say I'm back to full strength, but it is not where you want to be when you're not on top form.
Thanks, Martyn. Do you think that she'll act on the First Minister's suggestion that she should stand for a seat in Holyrood?
Well, I think every one of us would like to stand for a seat in Holyrood, and I think Mary would add an awful lot of talents to the Holyrood Parliament as well. So yeah, we should all be coming home hopefully fairly soon. We cannot do many more terms down there, and we've got to make sure the next election really does turbocharge the independence agenda, because that's the only solution, and then we can look at a much more interesting Scottish Parliament after that, with all the talents coming home as well.
Thanks, Martyn. And Sandra, how do you think she would get on in Holyrood if she were to become an MSP?
I think she would be great. She would, as she does now, say it as it is. I've got a great deal of respect for Martyn. I think she's wonderful. She's young. She was only 20. She wants a life. You know, you can't deny anybody wanting a life for that, basically. But I think she would be absolutely fantastic there. And that's what I like about her, basically. And people like about her. She doesn't fit into the mould that people think, you know, in Westminster you should fit into. She'd be so much better in Holyrood. But I completely understand why she wants to go just now. You know, you've got your whole life ahead of you. 20-year-old, you've done 2 stints. You need a life. And you need a university of life as well to see how things are. So good on you, Martyn. I wish her all the best, whatever she does.
Thanks, Sandra. What I would say to viewers is that I would recommend the Newsagents podcast where they interview Mary Blacken, where she revealed that she was going to stand down at the next election. They start out playing a clip of Mary in Westminster when she was and got into trouble for using the word pished to describe the Partygate parties in Number 10. And yeah, also I just loved it when she said that Westminster gave her the ick, so I would recommend that you all check it out. So that's the end of the show. Sandra, thank you. Martyn,
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Enjoyed it.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, and thank you for your patience with me as well. And yeah, Martyn, thanks for helping me out earlier on. So, well, that is it for this week's Full Scottish, but before I go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. You know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Right now we have a pressing need to raise £30,000 to pay our bills and to ensure that we are able to continue making programmes like this one. So thank you again to our guests, to Sandra and to Martyn. Hope to see you both again here in the studio. But let you get on with the rest of your weekends. So that's goodbye and thank you for watching.